Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
And good morning, everyone. Phil Penarski here with the News 8 Live Desk. Hope you're having a great start to your Tuesday. Digital reporter Matt Jaworowski is back on the Live Desk today to talk about his next installment in his digital exclusive series on the POW camps here in Michigan during World War II. And Matt, it's always great to see you. The last time we talked, we got a lot of awesome information. The first two stories are now out in this 5-part series, so highly encourage everybody to check them out. And then also even go back and re-watching the conversation Matt and I had. You got a lot more of awesome information about this topic that a lot of people don't really know a lot about. And this second story, Matt, I think also really answered a lot of questions that I myself had, and I know probably some other people had, about just how the prisoners were sort of treated in these camps during this time, during World War II. It was such a drastic difference from sort of the horror stories we've heard over the years in our history classes about how American soldiers were treated in overseas camps. I mean, that was a pretty stark difference, and you really emphasized that a little bit more in this story as well.
Right, yeah, we kind of dive into that. So there were approximately 120,000 American soldiers who were taken prisoner during World War II between the European and the Pacific battles. And obviously what they experienced was notably different than the experience that the European POWs had here in the States. As we dive into the story, there's a focus on the Geneva Conventions, the international laws that were put in place before this that kind of dictate what these countries should do to humanely house these prisoners, because they don't want to just release them and let them go back to the front lines of the war, but they can't just hold them in these dire conditions, which unfortunately we've seen in several instances. And so part 2 of this series kind of talked about the camps here in the States, where the War Department did their best to follow the Geneva Conventions as far as making sure that for every camp, every prisoner had living quarters. Every camp had to have a mess hall, a rec room, that kind of stuff. They were given adequate food. They were not forced into labor, and they couldn't do any work related to the war effort. And so that's kind of what the first part focuses on, is how those camps came to be and why they were such a big help. Obviously, they couldn't work for the war effort to build tanks or ammunition or anything like that, but they could come over and help farmers who were desperate for workers to handle their harvests, or the factories that were short on manpower because so many people were off fighting the war. So that's how these POWs kind of fit in. And so that's part 1. Part 2 kind of dives into these communities accepting the fact that the enemy is now living across the street and working odd jobs, and you see them going up and down the street, and how a lot of communities, especially here in Michigan, kind of initially reacted negatively and didn't want the POWs here until they kind of met the POWs and interacted with them and saw how much it helped local businesses and local farmers. And it was a kind of, hey, I'm from German ancestry, you're from Germany. We have a lot more alike than we have in common, or a lot more alike than we don't have, and a lot of differences of why they were brought into the war and whether they wanted to be there in the first place, all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of emotional untangling and all of that. And then it doubles down when you hear all the horror stories trickling back home of how American prisoners are being treated overseas. There are a lot of red flags raised as well. Why are the German and Italian POWs here being treated so fairly, so humanely? So that ruffled a lot of feathers.
Yeah, no, I think that is something that I kind of wanted to emphasize when we were talking about this, because I know the title of the story kind of asked that question, were German soldiers coddled in these POW camps? And it really does stem from the Geneva Convention. Was it necessarily, that the American POW camps, the ones we saw in Michigan, they were following those sort of guidelines to ensure that these prisoners, while they are prisoners of war, they're still treated humanely, and can't necessarily say that for maybe some of the other camps or maybe some of the other experiences that American soldiers had. But did want to emphasize that, and you talked to Gregory Sumner, who wrote a book kind of detailing these as well. And one thing I found super interesting in that conversation you had, and one quote that he talked about was sort of how these prisoners were actually kind of happy to be captured almost, because they kind of felt in that same way where they don't necessarily agree with kind of what the war is coming to, but they were forced into fighting for their country. And so I guess kind of with that, taking everything away with that, what did you really understand or come to understand from that conversation with Sumner, and just learning about more about the nuances behind, say, just a standard story writing up that, hey, Michigan used to have POW camps.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things I talked to him about, was the differences between camps and why they seem so stark. And he really brought up kind of the big issue was food. A lot of American POWs overseas starved. They really struggled. They went without basic food and water and medical attention, all those things, partly because those militaries couldn't provide it. They're struggling to provide those things for their own soldiers. And so in the American camps, part of, as Americans hear these stories coming back from across the ocean of, yeah, we've got our prisoners and they're not being fed, they don't get enough water, they're sleeping on the ground, X, Y, and Z, all these horrible things. And then you see this tent camp across the street where these soldiers are playing soccer on Sundays and having big meals and drinking beer and spending all their money on Coke and chocolate bars.
Right.
There's a real difference there. And Sumner really he broke that down as saying some of that is a little more exaggerated, using a derogatory term at the time, but a lot of people refer to the camp as the Fritz Ritz, kind of saying like, these guys have it made. They have the easy life right now. And he kind of walked that back. He's like, these camps were definitely more, the term he used was Spartan. They weren't ritzy, fancy hotels. Some of them were literally tent camps, tents. They're not even in buildings. But they obviously were removed from the war and had the basic necessities that they needed that in a lot of cases they didn't have on the front lines. I know a lot of you hear some of the stories that from Sumner's book and from other firsthand, accounts. Part of the reason why the German soldiers were happy to be captured or turned themselves in, whether they wanted to fight the war, believed in the war effort or not, is because they didn't have enough food. And they came to these camps and they're getting 3 square meals a day with the ability to buy snacks and buy other things, even telling their families back home where, hey, things are really tight, you guys are trying to ration food for X, Y, and Z, don't send it here, we have enough. It's more important that you make sure that civilians are finding what they need. So there's some real stark contrast there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just looking at some of these photos, Matt, does it necessarily look like a bad time? I mean, we see a couple people playing cards, but I mean, that's something that you might see in a prison today, or just
sure.
These aspects don't necessarily tell the full story, but definitely encourage everybody to check out these first 2 parts, because it explains so much behind this part of history that, as I mentioned, I had no idea about, and I'm sure a lot of people don't know about as well. So again, this is a 5-part series. The first 2 parts are out right now, courtesy of Matt. You can find them on our website, woodtv.com. And the 3rd part is set to debut this Sunday. Matt, tell us a little bit about what people can expect in this 3rd part.
Yeah, a slightly different turn. It's actually kind of more focusing on one person. His name is Ernst Floder, or Flutter, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. But he was a German POW who went through the camp system here in Michigan, he was a POW for almost 2 years before the war ended, and he was eventually sent back home to Germany, kind of sharing his whole story from how he was drafted and why he joined the service as opposed to waiting for the draft, even though he did not want to fight, to how he was captured, to his whole trip through the system, and then eventually how he found his way back to the United States years after the war ended and ended up living here for almost 50 years. So this is my favorite story of the series because Ernst provides a lot of detail in his story, and he really proved to be an incredible character when it comes to writing a story. Character is everything. So I encourage a lot of people to check that out this coming Sunday. It's a good one.
Yeah, no, we're very excited about that one, and yes, Matt said it himself. It's his favorite one, so you're definitely going to want to check it out, and of course you can find the first 2 parts and all of the parts once they're all released over the next couple of weeks over on our website, woodtv.com. Matt, one last time, thank you so much for stopping by. We'll see you next week.
Always, thank you.
Of course, and I want to thank everybody else for tuning into this latest edition of the News 8 Live Desk. I'm Phil Penarski, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.